For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi on the talking point. We are looking at the India, Middle East or West Asia and Europe connectivity corridor and the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, MBS's visit, or the state official visit to India with Ambassador Navdeep Suri. Suri, welcome to StratNews again. Thanks for your time, sir.
Pleasure.
If you could explain this route, even though there are not many details in public, the modalities, and how much, in your knowledge, has already been developed or has to be developed. President Biden described it as a real big deal. And especially if you can give us the nuance of whether we're looking at Fujairah port on the Gulf of Oman or the Jebel Ali port for the ships from India to reach the UAE.
Well, that's a lot of questions in one question, Amitabh. So let me try and pick them up one by one. Look, as far as Jebel Ali versus Fujairah is concerned, and it's a nice little graphic that you have, the existing connections between the west coast of India and Jebel Ali are very strong, very well organized. Whether it's Mundla, Kandla, Nhava Sheva, Kochi, all of these have regular sailings to Jebel Ali port, and Jebel Ali port in Dubai has the requisite infrastructure for transshipment of goods onwards. In fact, if you see two data points, our exports to UAE are about $32–34 billion. Not all of this is obviously consumed by the UAE market. It's not a large enough market. So clearly significant amounts get already transshipped to places like East Africa, Central Asia, even Pakistan and Iran in some cases. The total volume of trade between India and the Gulf and the GCC is our largest trading partner as a bloc, is already about $240–250 billion. So those channels are well established. There's nothing really that you need to do as far as the physical trade aspect is concerned. And that's the one that we are taking up first, because there are other dimensions of it that we want to come to. The next leg is UAE to Saudi Arabia's border. And there, whether the UAE point is Jebel Ali or Fujairah, the pros and cons are Jebel Ali has all the infra in place, but it is within, to reach Jebel Ali, you need to go through the Strait of Hormuz, and so you've got a potential choke point over there. Fujairah, on the tip of UAE, is outside the Straits of Hormuz. The Emiratis have already developed it as a bunkering station where ships can dock and refuel and so on. But the additional infrastructure will have to be created. Either way, from Jebel Ali or Fujairah, there's a Etihad rail freight link to the Saudi border. From the Saudi border, they are working to a place called Harith. And that's a link that needs to be completed, but its work is already underway. From there is the longest chunk of the line, about 1,320 kilometers to the Jordanian border. And that is largely done. And then you need about a 300-kilometer connect from the Jordanian-Saudi border to the port of Haifa in Israel, which also, I guess, about 70 kilometers that's within Israel, there's already an existing rail link. So as far as the trade side is concerned, a good chunk of the infrastructure is in place. The rest will get built up. You already have regular sailings from the port of Haifa in Israel to Piraeus in Greece. And Piraeus in Greece is the large European transshipment point from where goods can go by rail to any point in Europe. But I think when you talk about trade connectivity, as important as the physical transport of goods is the softer side of standardization. Are we talking about the same sized containers going all the way? Are we talking about standardized railway gauges that interconnect with so that you don't need to load and unload the cargoes more than once? Are you talking about harmonization of customs frameworks so that goods can move seamlessly from one country to another? But as I said, both will have to be worked on. But once you do that, the physical part of the trade connectivity should fall into place. And it's important because given the volume of trade that India has with Europe, which is our second largest trading partner as a bloc, you are currently entirely dependent on the Suez Canal as the route from which everything passes. It takes about 18 days. It's expensive. You pay about $700-800 per ship to cross the canal. And it leaves you vulnerable if an incident like what we had a couple of years back with a ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal and all hell breaks loose because suddenly you discover that your supply chains are broken. So if you need to also add to resilient supply chains, then having this alternate certainly makes a lot of sense, even though initially there might appear to be a bit of redundancy in it. But that's the trade part, and I'm happy to move on to the other aspects of it, including the geopolitical aspects.
Sure. I'm talking about the geopolitical aspects. Do you see this, if and when it is completed and it fructifies, as an alternative to China's BRI? This is just a month before the BRI forum. And also, if you could explain, like you were talking about IMEC and the INSTC, can they coexist?
Yeah, I think, look, the global trade is growing. India's share in global trade is bound to grow. The trends are very clear. As supply chains get reorganized post-COVID, we are seeing more manufacturers shift their production bases to India. So I expect that over the next 10, 20, 30 years, India's exports should continue to grow, whether it's to the Gulf or indeed to Europe. I think the difference between INSTC, the North-South corridor, and this one is that the North-South corridor really essentially goes to the Caspian states, to the Central Asian region. This one is looking much more at West Europe as the market. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, they are putting their network together, but I think as of now, it's more focused on ports. The remarkable thing about the India Middle East or India West Asia corridor to Europe is, at one level, you're really reviving an old spice route that has existed for thousands of years. The medieval Arab merchants used to catch the monsoon winds and used to sail to the Malabar coast or to Surat or Kutch in Gujarat and camp there, and then catch the return winds, take back the goods with them, and carry them on camel pretty much along the routes that your map is showing, or carry them to the to Egypt and across from Safaga to the Nile and up the Nile to the Mediterranean and then across. So this combination of multimodal, right now you're talking about rail and sea. Previously it used to be camel and sea. has existed for quite a while. I think that there's going to be enough traffic for all. But I think it's important that we certainly shouldn't be dependent as the largest economy in the region. We shouldn't be dependent on a China-sponsored artery. It cuts into our strategic autonomy and creates dependencies that we certainly do not wish to encourage.
So a mirror in a way of the ancient spice route versus the ancient silk route. But what do you see is the US role in any future success for IMEC? Some experts say the US is trying to reassert its relevance. West Asia also looking at strategic autonomy like India is. And the Chinese mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran as well?
Yeah, I think, look, if you break it down to the key players who are involved in this, and certainly US has been leading the charge on this, the genesis is fairly clear. If you go back about 4 or 5 years, you had a strong feeling, particularly post-Trump, that the Biden administration was going to disengage from the West Asia region, that they were talking about a pivot to Asia, and for them that pivot to Asia meant the Indo-Pacific, and that their focus would really be on China. And you could see the disquiet building in countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, which had traditionally been steadfast US allies. I think the US commitment to the region came into question when both Saudi Arabia and UAE were targeted by supposedly Iranian origin drone strikes, and they took out a large part of the oil infrastructure of UAE. And the Americans didn't do very much to come to the support or the defense of Saudi Arabia. So you had that disquiet building, apart from the whole Adnan, the Khashoggi story, and the shadow that it cast on the relationship. I think a couple of years down the administration, the Americans realized that the West Asia region is too important to be ignored, and they need to dial themselves back into the region. Otherwise, they are leaving the field open for the Chinese. And I think this feeling particularly grew after the red carpet treatment that the Saudis gave to Xi Jinping when he visited, I think, in December last year. So all of that was conflating. But there was a second set of circumstances which was taking place, and that started with the Abraham Accords, which were inked about 3 years back during the last year days of the Trump administration. And what they did was create this remarkable, rapidly growing relationship between Israel and UAE. And then Israel and UAE relationship, when they met for the first anniversary to celebrate the Abraham Accords in Washington, led to the genesis of the I2U2. Let's bring India into the equation. Let's create India, Israel, UAE, US as a nice little foursome to advance a strategic interest in the region. And interestingly, if you go back to October 21 and you look at the document that emerged from the first foreign ministers meeting of I2U2, and later reiterated during the first virtual summit of the I2U2, both speak about strategic transport connectivity. So you could see the seeds of this being sown during those conversations. And I think the Israelis were sort of the first off the mark, with Israeli transport minister at that time in the Netanyahu government, Israel Katz, speaking about a peace railway or a regional railway which could bring peace to the region by connecting countries that had hitherto been adversaries. So Israel is one of the most enthusiastic supporters of this corridor. And then you had the meeting of the 4 national security advisors in Riyadh in May this year. Our NSA, Mr. Doval, went, and the other 3 were there: US, UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And even though Israel was not there, it was clear that Israel is going to be part of the equation because they'd been talking about it. And so you got the first inklings of this deal that was brewing after that Riyadh meeting of the 4 very powerful NSAs of these countries. And now that you've got this, you can see that it's been from behind, been carefully steered by the Americans. They have both China in mind and West Asia in mind. But there's nothing antithetic to our interests in this. While it's easy to say it serves the American interests, it also serves our interests for similar reasons. And that's why I think we can happily embrace it and go with it with full vigor.
Some analysts raised questions. You were talking about multi-mode transport here, with shipping, freight, rail, and possibly even road. Have raised questions on the economic feasibility of multi-mode transport. Any response to that?
Yeah, I think the financing of this is extremely important, and the financials are extremely important. If it is not commercially viable, it will not succeed. And we have enough Chinese BRI projects to show that if it's not commercially viable, it won't succeed, because you've got plenty of connectivity that China has established in areas that were not commercially viable. So I think that's a lot of hard number crunching has to be done to make sure that it stands on its own 2 feet or 8 feet, as the case might be in this case. But I think what it has going in its favor is that it is more than just a trade corridor. And that's why I want to highlight the three other aspects which are critical and which have also already been included in the initial design or in the initial framework. The first is a clean energy pipeline. Now, everybody is talking about green hydrogen as the fuel of the future. The Europeans are probably going to end up as major importers. When I was looking at some numbers, the Europeans estimate that at the very minimum by 2030, they will be importing 10 million tons. And to produce 10 million tons in today's terms requires about $200 billion of investment. When you look at India's numbers, they are huge. I was at this Invest Saudi conference, which was on the sidelines of the visit of Sheikh Mohammed bin Salman. And you could see the Saudis trying to pitch themselves as the forthcoming superpower in green hydrogen, saying, who's going to match our empty desert land, 365 days of sun, and abundant low-cost capital? And we intend to go into this whole hog. So if tomorrow's clean fuel is green hydrogen, and that's going to replace fossil fuels, then it makes a lot of economic sense for the future to have this clean energy, clean hydrogen pipeline that runs from India to West Asia all the way to Europe. And you're familiar with the very ambitious plans that the Ambanis, the Adanis, the L&T, the Renew, host of Indian business groups have announced to scale up their production of green hydrogen in India. The Prime Minister, the cabinet has already given $2.5 billion to developing India as a hub for green hydrogen. So there's a lot of action taking place in that space. The third dimension is an electricity grid. And so you're talking about cables that will connect. India, as part of its leadership of the International Solar Alliance, has been advocating, has been articulating, along with the France and UK, the idea of a one sun, one word, one grid. And the idea here really is that if you look at the sun shining in different time zones at different times and generating solar power at different times in different geographies, if you could connect them, then you wouldn't need so much of expensive energy storage. You would be able to move that electricity literally as the sun moves across the grid. And I know these are futuristic ideas, but given where our fossil fuels have led us, I think it's important that we look at the creative side of this and say, where's the world heading? Not where it is in 2023 or where it was in 2013, but 2033 and 43 and beyond. And then you may be seeing that these ideas of an interconnected electricity grid make sense, and an idea of clean hydrogen pipelines makes sense. And finally, if data is the new oil, as everybody says, you also need secure data pipelines. Whether it's the Quad or elsewhere, cybersecurity is really front and center of all major strategic conversations these days. And so if on one hand you're talking about trusted partners, then you also need trusted data pipelines that will connect the partners. And I think for India, given the head start that we have in export of IT services, this could be very, very interesting as we go forward, that if there are these secure data pipelines, high-speed data links connecting India with West Asia, with Europe. So I think when you look at the package together and not just as a ship rail combo, probably it makes more sense. But again, it does need a bit of a leap of faith to go forward in future, and look at where the scenarios are going to be, because this is going to take time to build. So you want to be planning for where you will be rather than where you are or where you're coming from.
Talking about the immediate future, Ambassador, the MOU also says the participants intend to meet within the next 2 months to, I think the exact quote is, to develop and commit to an action plan with relevant timetables.
Yeah, and I'd be watching that with a lot of interest to see what happens between now and the 60 days, and then what happens during that meeting. What kind of plans do people bring to the table? What is the announcement that emerges from that? And where's the money coming from? I think in a sense, it's fortunate that you not only have the US, which can bring private capital to the table. You have the US Build Back Better program. You have the European programs to transition towards clean energy. And you have two powerhouses financially in Saudi and UAE, each with a sovereign fund with about $1 trillion. And so I think if the viability of the project is established, then the financing should be not the hard part. And then people can get to work, the drawing board in terms of actually working groups that look at the transport part, the clean energy part, the electricity part, and the data part. You will have probably 4 different working groups working to put flesh to bones.
You talked about ITU2, you talked about the seeds of this particular project, but just want you, Ambassador, to step back and give us perspective on the big picture in terms of changes in West Asia, Saudi Arabia and Iran moving towards rapprochement, MBS's reforms looked at extremely significant. You mentioned Israel and ITU2, but the growing economies also that you talked about, Saudi Arabia and UAE in the region, looking to diversify, and also following their own strategic autonomy like India is?
I think there are probably 4 or 5 key trends that you could look at as they are unfolding in the region. The first is that the West Asia region today is more at peace with itself than it was, say, 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you had major rifts between the Arab quartet of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain on one side, and Qatar on the other. You had a major rift between Turkey on one side and Saudi and UAE on the other. Of course, you had the huge rift between Iran on one side and the Saudis and the Emiratis on the other, and the Egyptians. Today, all 3 have been pacified to a certain extent. Egypt and Turkey are back on talking terms. Turkey's exchanged high-level visits. Erdogan, I think, finally realizes that he can't allow his political ambitions to get ahead of his economic realities, and is now seeking investments from UAE and Saudi Arabia. The Chinese have claimed credit for bringing Saudi and Iran together, even though I think a lot of the groundwork was done in meetings over the last 2 or 2.5 years in Baghdad and in Oman, and certainly their role should be recognized as well in bringing it together. So I think the overall trend today is of fewer intra-regional conflicts and a region that's more peaceful, more stable than it was 3 or 4 years ago. The second trend that you are seeing is, because the Americans loudly declared their pivot to Asia, the countries in the region were forced to take responsibility for themselves and bury the hatchet in some cases, because they realized that they can't any longer depend upon the Americans to do that. And that, as part of that, they started thinking of multi-alignment rather than depending on the Americans. So today, whether you look at the Saudis, the Emiratis, or the others, they are reducing the dependence on the Americans, but also opening up to China, to India, to Russia, to each other, and trying to create a greater space for strategic autonomy in their own foreign policies. And that's something that is very, very visible. The third is Israel being dialed into the region. And again, if you go back 3 or 5 years and pre-Abraham Accords and where the situation is today, the change, I think, is most dramatic in the relations with Israel, of Israel with UAE, where today you have daily flights and you have a chief rabbi in Dubai and you have kosher certified restaurants and textbooks being cleaned up of anti-Semitic references and all of that. There's a lot going on between Israel and UAE, and in UAE itself to position itself differently. You hear all of this talk in Washington about Biden trying to stitch together a grand deal, which will establish relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. It still needs a lot of work. There is a problem that the Israeli government at present is more right-wing than any that we have seen in Israel for many years, and some of its actions are causing disquiet. But nevertheless, we are aware that under the table, below the horizon, there are sufficient levels of engagement between Saudi Arabia and Israel that are taking place, even while they don't have diplomatic relations. So Israel today in the region has formal relations with Bahrain and with UAE, reasonable ties with Oman, where they've exchanged high-level visits, and substantial but undeclared ties with Saudi Arabia. And that's a new trend that has emerged in the region. So when you look at all of this geopolitical flux that is taking place, I think the overall environment today is more conducive geopolitically than it was 5 years back. 5 years back, you could not have contemplated this.
Just again, looking at the bigger picture and trying to connect dots, the Prime Minister's visit to Greece, elevating that to a strategic partnership, reports of Adani terminal in Piraeus, CEPA with UAE, negotiations on an FTA with the GCC and maybe the EU. If all those dots are connected, does that also help propel this whole larger picture?
Well, not just this. In addition to the Prime Minister's visit to Greece and talking about the strategic partnership, he also spoke about connectivity during his more recent visit to Jakarta for the ASEAN meetings. So there is also futuristic plan that you could potentially bring ASEAN into the equation, probably one step at a time. It's taken us a very long time to establish our own rail corridor or road linkages in the ASEAN, and we know the challenges that the situation in Myanmar and other factors have created. But you can also see where the thinking of leaders is today in terms of a more interconnected world. And while we've talked about globalization for 20-25 years, you're probably talking about a more decentralized globalization, and rather than China being the manufacturing hub and the trading hub of the world, you're looking at multiple points emerging.
On another note, when you look at the state visit of the Crown Prince and Prime Minister MBS India, Saudi Arabia, how much movement or potential can you see? Like, for example, what we've started with the UAE in terms of payment for petroleum products in national currencies or trade in national currencies, let me put it larger.
I think those conversations have started but haven't been culminated yet. But I think, we have a very special relationship with UAE, and there's no doubt about that. And UAE has been exceptionally forthcoming when it came to our concerns, whether it was on Jammu and Kashmir or Article 370 or whatever else. But a friendly, strategically close Saudi Arabia is a very important thing for us. It is the regional powerhouse. It dominates the economy in the region. And beyond just the potential of oil in rupees, I think there's something more profound. The changes that MBS has initiated to make Saudi Arabia a more normal country, to literally take away the power of the religious police and the ulema who were trying to push the country back into the medieval ages. And we saw that situation pretty much from 1979 till about 4 or 5 years back. When you look at what's happening today in Saudi Arabia, not just women driving, not just Formula One races or rave concerts, or when you land at Riyadh, pretty much all the immigration officers are women that you see. You saw the number of women, young women, very bright, very confident, who are part of the Saudi business delegation that came earlier this week. That change, which is happening in Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is unique, because the King of Saudi Arabia is the custodian of the two holy mosques of Makkah and Medina, because it is seen as the fountainhead of so much of Islamic thought. From a point where most of the reactionary medieval ideas used to come from Saudi Arabia, to Saudi Arabia becoming a proponent of modernization, has implications for our Muslims, particularly the more conservative ulema that we have in India. You will see its impact next door in Pakistan. You can already see Afghanistan, which is craving for legitimacy through recognition by the Saudis and has not received it. In fact, the Saudis are appalled by what the Taliban are doing to women, because it's happening at a time when you're seeing women emancipation in Saudi Arabia. And the last numbers I saw was women participation in the workforce has risen to 34% in Saudi Arabia. Now, because Saudi Arabia is so unique in terms of Islam, what happens there has these larger regional implications. It has larger implications for perceptions of Islam globally. And I think even while we talk about the economics of it, one shouldn't disregard this very significant change that we are witnessing before our eyes.
Ambassador Navdeep Suri, as usual, sir, thank you so much for your time and sharing such a wide-ranging and comprehensive perspective of not just the region, but global flux, as you pointed out.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Pleasure's ours, Ambassador. And for our viewers, do follow our social media handles for the latest that we put up on our website, or interviews like this one with Ambassador Suri on a YouTube channel. You can also help support us financially if you're so inclined. There's a QR code that's flashing on your screen that you just have to scan. This is The Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi.